The baby's cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife through Jake Morrison's heart. He walked the length of his small cabin again, bouncing little Emma in his arms, but nothing worked anymore. Her tiny voice had grown weaker each day since her mama died, and now was barely more than a whisper. Jake stopped in front of the window and stared out at the gray Colorado morning. For days. It had been 4 days since Sarah took her last breath, and he was failing at the one thing she'd asked him to do. Keep their baby alive. Come on, sweetheart, he whispered to Emma, his voice rough from exhaustion. You gotta eat something. Please. But when he tried to give her the sugar water again, she turned her tiny head away. Her little lips were dry and pale. Her eyes, which should have been bright blue like her mama's, seemed dull and sunken. Behind him, Sarah lay still on their bed, covered with her best quilt. Jake couldn't bring himself to bury her yet, not while Emma was still fighting. It felt like giving up on both of them at once. He tried everything he could think of. Cow's milk made Emma sick to her stomach. Goat's milk from the neighbor's farm just sat in her mouth. He'd even tried dipping his finger in honey water, but she wouldn't suck on it. Nothing worked. She was starving, and he didn't know how to save her. Jake sank into his wooden chair by the fireplace, still holding Emma close to his chest. The fire had burned down to embers hours ago, and the cabin felt cold. Everything felt cold without Sarah's laugh filling up the empty spaces. He remembered the day Emma was born. Sarah had been in labor for 18 hours, and there was no doctor for 50 miles. Jake had delivered his own daughter with shaking hands, following Sarah's instructions even as she grew weaker with each push. When Emma finally came, purple and silent, Jake thought they'd lost her too. But Sarah had rubbed the baby's back and breathed into her tiny lungs until Emma let out her first cry. She's perfect, Sarah had whispered, even as blood soaked the sheets beneath her. Take care of her, Jake. Promise me. He promised. But promises were easier to make than keep. Now Emma's breathing was getting shallow, and her crying had stopped altogether. Jake pressed his ear to her tiny chest and felt panic shoot through him. Her heartbeat was there, but so faint he could barely hear it. No, he said out loud, standing up fast. No, you don't get to leave me too. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. Maybe he could still make it to town. Dr. Henderson would know what to do. But when Jake looked outside, his heart sank. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, moving fast across the plains. A winter storm was coming, and it looked like a bad one. The kind that could bury a man and his horse in snow within hours. Jake calculated the distance in his head. 50 miles to town, maybe 60 with the drifts that were probably already forming. Emma wouldn't survive the trip, not in her condition. And if the storm hit while they were on the trail, they'd both die out there. He sat back down, feeling the weight of defeat settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Through the window, he could see the first snowflakes starting to fall. Big, wet flakes that meant the storm would be fierce and long. Emma made a small sound, more like a sigh than a cry. Jake looked down at her face and saw that her lips had turned slightly blue around the edges. His chest tightened with fear. I'm sorry, baby girl, he whispered, touching her soft cheek with one finger. I'm so sorry I can't figure this out. Your mama wouldn't know what to do. The wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin windows. Jake could hear it whistling through the gaps in the walls, bringing the cold in with it. He pulled Sarah's shawl from the back of the rocking chair and wrapped it around Emma, but she felt so small inside all that wool, like she was disappearing. Jake thought about his own mother, dead since he was 12. He thought about Sarah's mother, who lived back east and didn't even know her daughter was gone. He thought about all the women in the world who seemed to know instinctively how to keep babies alive and wondered why God had left him so helpless. The storm hit hard just as the sun should have been rising. Snow lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a wild animal. Jake moved closer to the fireplace, trying to keep Emma warm, but he'd run out of wood the night before. The cabin grew colder by the hour. Emma had stopped making any sound at all. Her tiny chest still rose and fell, but barely. Jake held her against his heart and found himself praying for the first time since his mother died. He wasn't even sure he believed in God anymore, but desperation made a man willing to try anything. If you're up there, he whispered into the storm, And if you care about innocent babies, please help me. I don't know what else to do." The wind answered him with another fierce gust that shook the whole cabin. Jake closed his eyes and held Emma tighter, feeling like he was already saying goodbye to her. In a few hours, maybe less, he'd be alone in this cabin with two bodies instead of one. The thought made his throat close up with grief. Just then, through the howling of the storm, Jake heard something that made him lift his head. It sounded like knocking. Soft but steady, like someone tapping on his door with careful fingers. Jake froze, listening hard. There was again 3 gentle knocks, barely audible over the wind. His heart started beating faster. Nobody should be out in weather like this. Nobody could be. But the knocking came again, patient and persistent. With Emma still in his arms, Jake walked slowly toward the door. His hand hesitated on the latch. What if it was just the wind playing tricks on him? What if his grief and exhaustion had finally made him start hearing things that weren't there? But the knocking came once more, and this time Jake was sure. Someone was standing outside his door in the middle of a blizzard, and they needed help. Or maybe, Jake thought as his fingers closed around the door handle, maybe they were there to help him. The wind had been building all afternoon, rattling the cabin's wooden shutters with increasing fury. Jake Morrison barely noticed. His entire world had shrunk to the bundle in his arms, his daughter Emma, whose breathing had grown so shallow he had to press his ear to her tiny chest just to confirm she still lived. The blizzard struck with the sudden violence that only Colorado winters could deliver. Snow pelted the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel, and the temperature plummeted until frost began forming on the inside of the glass. Jake pulled the quilt tighter around Emma, though she barely stirred. Her lips, once pink as her mother's, had taken on a bluish tinge that made his stomach clench with dread. "Please, baby girl," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please don't leave me too." He glanced toward the bed where Sarah lay beneath the patchwork coverlet they'd received as a wedding gift. For days she'd been gone, and still he couldn't bring himself to do what needed doing. The frozen ground made burial impossible anyway, he told himself. But the truth cut deeper. He couldn't bear to put her in the cold earth when everything warm and living in his world was slipping away. Emma's chest rose and fell in irregular patterns now. Each pause between breaths lasted longer than the last, and Jake found himself holding his own breath in terrified sympathy. The baby who had screamed with such fierce determination just days ago could barely summon the strength to whimper. The storm raged harder, shaking the entire cabin. Somewhere in the distance, a tree crashed to the ground with a sound like thunder. Jake stood and paced to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass into the white void beyond. Even if he could somehow get to his horse, even if the animal could navigate the drifts, the nearest town was 50 miles of treacherous mountain passes away. Emma wouldn't survive an hour in this weather. He returned to the rocking chair Sarah had insisted they buy when they first learned she was with child. "For the baby," she'd said, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "Every baby needs to be rocked to sleep by their mama." But Sarah would never rock their daughter. That duty, like so many others, had fallen to Jake, and he was failing at it just as he'd failed at everything else that mattered. The baby's breathing stopped. Jake's heart seized in his chest as he stared down at the motionless bundle. 1 second, 2, 3. Then Emma drew in a shuddering breath, so faint he almost missed it. But it came, and another after it, each one a small miracle and a greater torment. He closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair, feeling defeat settle over him like a shroud. He lost his wife. Now he would lose his daughter. The Morrison line would end here, in this cabin, on this terrible night. At 28 years old, Jake would have nothing left but the howling wind and his own crushing failure. It was then, in his moment of absolute surrender, that he heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft raps on the cabin door, barely audible above the storm's fury. Jake's eyes snapped open, certain he'd imagined it. Who could possibly be traveling in weather like this? The nearest neighbor was the Patterson place, 8 miles south, and no one with sense would venture out tonight. Knock, knock, knock. There was again, patient, gentle, but unmistakably real. Jake stood slowly, Emma cradled against his chest and approached the door with the caution of a man who'd learned that hope could be the cruelest emotion of all. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse from days of little use. "A friend," came the reply, a woman's voice, warm and steady despite the storm. "I heard a baby crying on the wind." Jake's hand hesitated on the door latch. There was something impossible about those words. The wind had been howling for hours. No one could have heard Emma's faint whimpers from any distance. Yet here stood someone claiming exactly that. He opened the door. The woman on his threshold was perhaps 45 years old, with silver-streaked black hair escaping from beneath a wool shawl. Her skin was weathered brown, her dark eyes kind but alert. Most remarkably, she seemed entirely unaffected by the blizzard raging around her. Snow clung to her heavy coat, but she stood steady and calm, as if she'd simply stepped out of a warm room rather than fought her way through a mountain storm. "May I come in?" she asked in accented English, her voice carrying the musical cadence of Spanish. "The little one needs help, yes?" Jake stepped back, too stunned to do anything but nod. The woman entered, bringing with her not the bitter cold he expected, but somehow a sense of warmth and refuge. She removed her coat, revealing worn but clean clothing and a pair of well-used saddlebags that she set carefully on the table. "I am Maria Santos," she said, moving toward him with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to entering strangers' homes in times of crisis. "And this," she looked down at Emma with eyes that had seen much. "This Pequeña is very sick, no?" "She won't eat," Jake said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "She hasn't taken anything for 3 days. I've tried everything. Cow's milk, sugar water, even—" He stopped, embarrassed by his desperation. Maria held out her hands. "May I?" Jake hesitated. Emma was all he had left, the last piece of Sarah in the world. But as he looked into Maria's calm, knowing eyes, something in his chest loosened slightly. Reluctantly, he placed his daughter in the stranger's arms. Maria examined the baby with practiced hands, checking her temperature, looking at her eyes and mouth, listening to her breathing. She murmured soft words in Spanish, a gentle lullaby that seemed to ease Emma's labored breathing. "She is weak, but not lost," Maria said finally. "The mother—" Jake nodded toward the bed, unable to speak. Maria crossed herself. "Lo siento. I am sorry for your loss." She looked back at Emma. "But this one, she fights still. She waits for someone to show her how to live." From her saddlebags, Maria produced a cloth bundle that, when unwrapped, revealed a still warm loaf of bread. The smell filled the cabin, yeast and grain, and something indefinably comforting. She tore off a small piece and began to chew it slowly, working it into a soft paste. "What are you doing?" Jake asked. "What mothers have done for babies who cannot take milk," Maria replied. "Sometimes the old ways work best." She dipped her finger into the chewed bread, now mixed with her saliva, and gently touched it to Emma's lips. The baby's mouth moved slightly, and Maria repeated the action. On the third try, Emma's tiny tongue darted out to taste the offering. And for the first time in 3 days, Jake Morrison's daughter swallowed. The baby's crying stopped entirely then, but not in the way Jake had feared. Instead of the silence of death, it was the quiet of peace, of a child finally able to rest. Emma's breathing grew steadier, her color less alarming. In the space of minutes, Maria Santos had accomplished what Jake's desperate efforts could not. As the storm continued to rage outside, Jake stared at this stranger who had appeared from nowhere with bread and hope, wondering if he was witnessing a miracle or simply dreaming his own desperate salvation into existence. Dawn crept through the cabin windows, revealing the storm's aftermath in drifts of pristine snow that reached halfway up the door. But inside, a different kind of miracle was unfolding. Emma had slept through the night. Truly slept, not the fitful unconsciousness of the dying, but the deep, restorative sleep of a baby beginning to heal. Jake hadn't moved from the chair beside her makeshift crib, afraid that any motion might shatter this fragile piece. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, counting each breath like a miser counting gold. Across the room, Maria moved quietly about the cabin, her presence somehow making the space feel less like a tomb and more like a home. She is stronger already, Maria said, approaching with a steaming cup that smelled of unfamiliar herbs. But she will need more than bread to grow. Jake looked up at this woman who had appeared from nowhere to save his daughter. In the morning light, she seemed less mysterious but no less remarkable. Her weathered hands spoke of decades of hard work, and her eyes held a depth of experience that made him feel like a child in comparison. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know to come here?" Maria settled into Sarah's rocking chair, testing its rhythm with gentle movements. "I was camped in the valley, maybe 5 miles south. The wind, it carried sounds. A baby's cry, so faint I almost missed it." She looked directly at him. "But when you have heard that sound as many times as I have, you do not mistake it for anything else. You're a midwife." "Partera, yes. I have caught babies for 30 years, since I was barely more than a girl myself." Her voice carried a note of pride. "In Mexico, in Texas, now here in Colorado, babies come when they will, and they need help when they need it." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I can't pay you much. The ranch isn't." Maria waved away his words. "Who speaks of payment? This little one needs help. That is enough." Emma stirred in her crib, making soft sounds that were nothing like the desperate wails of the past few days. Maria rose and lifted her carefully, examining her with the practiced eye of someone who understood infant needs by instinct. "She wants to eat again," Maria announced. "This is good. The appetite returns with the strength." She prepared another portion of the softened bread, but this time she also produced a small leather pouch from her bags. From it, she withdrew dried leaves that crumbled between her fingers. "What is that?" Jake asked, his protective instincts flaring. "Hierba buena. Mint, you would say. It settles the stomach and helps the body accept food." Maria mixed the herbs into warm water from a kettle. "My grandmother taught me, and her grandmother taught her. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones." As if to prove her point, Emma took the herbal mixture eagerly, her tiny hands grasping at Maria's fingers. Color continued to return to her cheeks, and her eyes, when they opened, seemed to focus with something approaching normal infant curiosity. Jake felt tears prick at his eyes, tears of relief so intense they frightened him. For days, he'd been preparing for the worst, steeling himself against the loss of everything he'd ever loved. To see hope return felt almost too dangerous to trust. "She's really going to live?" he whispered. "See, she will live. She's a fighter, this one. Like her papa, I think." The word hung in the air between them. Papa, father. Jake had been so focused on keeping Emma alive that he'd hardly had time to consider what came next. He was a father now, solely responsible for this tiny life. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical presence. Maria seemed to read his thoughts. "You are afraid." It wasn't a question. Jake nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. "This is good," she continued. "The men who are not afraid, they make the worst fathers. Fear keeps us careful. It makes us pay attention." She rose and moved toward the bed where Sarah still lay. Jake tensed, but Maria's approach was reverent, respectful. She pulled back the coverlet slightly and studied Sarah's peaceful face. She was very young, Maria said softly. 22. We'd only been married 2 years. Jake's voice broke slightly. "She wanted this baby so much. We both did." Maria nodded, her expression understanding. "She gave her life to bring this pequeña into the world. That is a mother's love, the strongest force there is." She looked back at Emma, now sleeping contentedly in her arms. And now that love lives in her daughter. "I don't know how to do this alone," Jake admitted. "I don't know how to be a father without a wife." Maria finished gently. "You think you are the first man to raise a child solo. You think fathers cannot love as deeply as mothers." She placed Emma back in the crib and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. In the distance, smoke was beginning to rise from other chimneys as neighbors started their morning fires. "You are not as alone as you think," she said. "Last night, before the storm hit full, I saw lights in the valley. Other families, other homes. They know you are here." "Yes." "They know about the baby." Jake shrugged. "We keep to ourselves mostly." Sarah was shy around strangers, and I never was much for socializing. Hmm. Maria's tone suggested she found this unsurprising but unfortunate. People need people, especially when there are little ones involved. A baby needs more than one person's love to grow properly. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the morning air. Jake tensed. Visitors had always made him uncomfortable, and in his current state, he felt particularly unprepared for company. I should get rid of whoever that is, he said, moving toward the door. Maria caught his arm gently but firmly. Perhaps you should see what they want first. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. The knock, when it came, was different from Maria's soft rapping of the night before. This was the firm, practical knock of neighbors who had business to conduct. Jake opened the door to find Mrs. Patterson from the South Range, her arms laden with packages, and behind her, old Tom Fletcher leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. "Jake Morrison," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble. "We heard about Sarah, and we've come to help." Jake stared at them, speechless. He'd barely exchanged a dozen words with these people in the 2 years he'd lived here. Yet here they stood with provisions and purpose. "The baby," Mrs. Patterson continued, pushing past his shock to peer into the cabin. Her eyes found Emma in the crib, then Maria standing quietly nearby. "Oh, thank the Lord. We heard the crying on the wind yesterday and feared. Well, we feared the worst." Tom Fletcher tipped his hat to Maria with old-world courtesy. "Ma'am, looks like you got here ahead of us." "The little one needed help quickly," Maria replied. "But she is much better now." Mrs. Patterson began unpacking her bundles with brisk efficiency. Preserved fruits, dried meat, fresh eggs, carefully wrapped in cloth. "I brought what I could on short notice. There's more at home when you need it." Jake found his voice at last. I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" The two neighbors exchanged a look that spoke of long friendship and shared understanding. "Because that's what neighbors do," Tom said simply. "Because that baby needs more than one man can provide, no matter how good his intentions. And because," he added more gently, "none of us should have to face the hard times alone." Jake looked around his cabin, at Emma sleeping peacefully, at Maria organizing Mrs. Patterson's gifts with practiced efficiency, at these neighbors who had appeared without being asked. For the first time since Sarah's death, the walls didn't feel like they were closing in. Instead, they seemed to be expanding, making room for something he'd never experienced before. Community, family beyond blood. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to do this alone after all. "I don't know how to repay," he began, but Mrs. Patterson cut him off with a wave of her hand. "You don't repay kindness," she said firmly. "You pass it on. Someday, when someone else needs help, you'll be the one showing up with supplies and a willing heart." Emma chose that moment to wake, her soft cooing filling the cabin with the sound of new life. As Maria lifted her and the baby's bright eyes took in all the faces surrounding her, Jake realized something profound was happening. His daughter wasn't just surviving. She was being welcomed into a world much larger and more loving than he'd ever imagined possible. The isolation that had defined his grief was beginning to crack, letting in light he hadn't known he was missing. 3 weeks had transformed Jake Morrison's world beyond recognition. Where once silence had reigned broken only by desperate crying, now the cabin hummed with the gentle sounds of daily life. Emma's laughter, a sound he'd feared he might never hear, rang out as she played with the wooden rattle Tom Fletcher had carved for her. She was sitting up now, her chubby hands exploring everything within reach, her bright eyes following Maria's movements around the cabin with obvious affection. Jake stood at the wash basin, carefully cleaning the breakfast dishes, a task he'd once left entirely to Sarah. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, had learned surprising gentleness in these weeks. Maria had shown him how to test the water temperature against his wrist, how to support Emma's head during feeding, how to read the different meanings in her cries. "She is ready for something more substantial than softened bread," Maria announced, watching Emma gnaw determinedly on her rattle. "Her teeth will come soon. Mrs. Patterson's preserved apples, mashed fine. This will help." The mention of Mrs. Patterson no longer made Jake uncomfortable. The older woman had visited twice more, each time bringing not just supplies but knowledge. She taught him about baby development, about the stages to expect, about the signs of illness to watch for. More importantly, she treated him not as a charity case, but as a neighbor deserving of respect and support. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, Jake could see Reverend Williams dismounting from his horse, his black coat a stark contrast against the lingering snow. Behind him rode another figure, a woman Jake recognized but had never formally met. "Good morning, Jake," the Reverend said when Jake opened the door. "I hope we're not intruding. I brought Mrs. Coleman, Beth Coleman. She's been wanting to meet little Emma." Beth Coleman was perhaps 25, with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet and green eyes that held both warmth and a deep understanding of loss. A boy of about 5 peeked out from behind her skirts, all freckles and curiosity. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I wanted to come sooner, but I thought you might need time." Jake stepped aside to let them enter, suddenly aware of his appearance. Unshaven, wearing the same work shirt for the 3rd day running. But Beth's attention went immediately to Emma, who was regarding the newcomers with bright interest. "Oh, she's beautiful," Beth breathed, and there was something in her tone that spoke of genuine appreciation rather than mere politeness. "She has her mother's coloring, doesn't she?" The comment might have brought pain weeks ago. Now, Jake found he could nod and even smile slightly. Sarah always hoped for a daughter with dark hair like hers. The boy, Tommy, Jake remembered, had spotted Maria arranging dried herbs on the table and was watching with fascination. "Are you making medicine?" Tommy asked with the directness of childhood. Maria smiled. "Sí, pequeño. Medicine from plants. Your mama, she knows about this too, I think." Beth flushed slightly. "I do some herb gathering. Nothing as skilled as yours, I'm sure." "Knowledge is knowledge," Maria replied. "It should be shared, not hoarded." Reverend Williams cleared his throat gently. "Jake, I wanted to speak with you about Sarah. I know the ground has been too frozen for proper burial, but the weather's warming now. If you're ready, the community would like to help arrange a service." The words hung in the air. Jake had been dreading this moment, even as he knew it was necessary. Sarah deserved better than the makeshift preservation that had been required by winter's harsh demands. He started, then stopped, looking at Emma. How could he explain to his daughter someday that he'd been too paralyzed by grief to give her mother a proper farewell? "The whole valley will come," Beth said quietly. Sarah was well loved, even if she was shy. People remember kindness. "I don't know what to say," Jake admitted. I don't know how to do this." "You don't have to do it alone," the Reverend assured him. "That's why we're here." Over the next hour, plans took shape. The service would be held in 3 days, enough time for word to spread to the scattered homesteads. Mrs. Patterson would coordinate the meal afterward. Jake protested that he couldn't afford to feed the whole community, but Beth gently explained that everyone would contribute something. Tom Fletcher and his sons would help prepare the grave. Maria would handle the flowers. She knew which early spring blooms would be appropriate. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself watching Beth interact with Emma. The young woman had a natural ease with children that spoke of experience, and Emma responded to her with the kind of immediate trust that surprised Jake. When the baby fussed, Beth instinctively reached for her, and Emma settled immediately against her shoulder. "You have a gift," Maria observed, noticing the same thing. Beth smiled sadly. "I had plenty of practice with Tommy. His father died when he was just 2, consumption. I've been both mother and father to him since then." The parallel wasn't lost on Jake. Here was another person who'd been forced to navigate parenthood alone, yet she seemed so much more confident than he felt. Tommy was clearly a well-adjusted, happy child, proof that it was possible to succeed at this overwhelming task. "How do you do it?" Jake found himself asking. "How do you know what's right?" "You don't most of the time," Beth replied honestly. "You just do your best and hope it's enough." The love makes up for a lot of mistakes. Tommy had discovered Emma's collection of rattles and was entertaining her with an elaborate game that involved hiding the toys and revealing them with dramatic flourishes. Emma giggled with delight, clapping her hands at each reappearance. "He's good with her," Jake observed. "He's always wanted a baby sister," Beth said, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I mean, I didn't mean to imply." But Jake found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. "It's all right. It's nice to see her playing with another child." As the visitors prepared to leave, Reverend Williams pulled Jake aside. "You're doing well," he said. "Better than you know. That little girl is lucky to have you." "I had help," Jake replied, glancing at Maria. "Yes, you did. And that's not something to be ashamed of. The strongest men I know are the ones who aren't afraid to accept help when they need it." After they'd gone, Jake sat in his rocking chair with Emma on his lap, watching Maria prepare their evening meal. The cabin felt different, not empty despite Sarah's absence, but full in a new way, full of possibility. "Maria," he said suddenly, "why did you really come here that night?" She paused in her work, considering the question. "I told you. I heard the baby crying. But why did you stay? You could have helped that first night and moved on. You've got your own life, your own travels." Maria set down her wooden spoon and turned to face him fully. "I had my own family once. A husband, 3 children. The fever took them all one winter 10 years ago now." Her voice was steady, but Jake could see the old pain in her eyes. "Since then, I have been searching. For purpose, for meaning, for a way to make sense of why I lived when they did not." Emma babbled softly, playing with Jake's shirt buttons. "When I walked into this cabin that night," Maria continued, "and saw this baby fighting for life, saw a man who loved her enough to break his own heart trying to save her, I knew why I had wandered so long. Some people are meant to have their own families. Others are meant to help families that need them. This is my family now, if you will have me." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and fear he'd carried for weeks. Here was this remarkable woman offering to make his struggle her own, not out of pity, but out of love. "What about your travels?" he asked. "There will always be people who need help," Maria replied. "But right now, you and Emma need me more than anyone else does. And perhaps," she added with a gentle smile, "I need you too." Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and pink. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jake looked toward tomorrow not with dread, but with something approaching hope. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was beginning to live again. And Emma, secure in his arms, gurgled contentedly as if she knew that the worst was behind them all. 6 months after Sarah's death, Jake Morrison barely recognized the man he'd become. Emma crawled everywhere now, her chubby hands exploring every corner of the cabin, while her infectious laughter filled spaces that had once echoed with despair. She pulled herself up on furniture, babbled constantly, and had developed a particular fondness for following Maria around the kitchen, banging wooden spoons against pots with gleeful determination. "She will walk soon," Maria observed, watching Emma cruise along the edge of the table. "Before the first snow comes again, I think." Jake smiled, continuing to fold the clean laundry, another skill Maria had patiently taught him. His hands, once clumsy with domestic tasks, now moved with practiced efficiency through Emma's tiny dresses and his own mended shirts. The cabin ran smoothly now, a testament to how much he'd learned about creating a home rather than simply occupying a house. A knock at the door brought Tommy Coleman's voice. "Mr. Jake, Mama says can we come in?" "Of course," Jake called, and Tommy burst through the door with his usual energy, followed by Beth carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and something sweet. "I brought apple tart," Beth announced, setting the basket on the table. Tommy helped with the apples. "I cut them all by myself," Tommy declared proudly, then immediately dropped to the floor where Emma was delightedly banging her spoon. Within moments, the 2 children were engaged in an elaborate musical performance that involved much giggling and percussion. Jake found himself watching Beth as she moved around his kitchen with comfortable familiarity, her presence no longer feeling like an intrusion, but like a natural part of the cabin's rhythm. Over these months, her visits had become regular, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just company, always welcome. "Tommy talks about Emma constantly," Beth said, watching the children play. I think he's already appointed himself her big brother. She adores him. Jake replied, I think she learns more from watching him than from anything Maria, and I try to teach her. Maria looked up from her herb sorting, a knowing smile playing at her lips. Children learn best from other children. It is natural, just as adults learn best when they are not trying so hard to be perfect. The comments seemed directed at Jake, who still sometimes caught himself second-guessing every parental decision. But he was getting better at trusting his instincts, better at understanding that love could compensate for inexperience. Jake, Beth said suddenly, her voice carrying a nervous edge. I wondered if you might like to come to dinner tomorrow. At our place. Tommy's been asking, and I thought. She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. Maria cleared her throat diplomatically. I have been meaning to visit Mrs. Patterson about her arthritis remedy. Perhaps tomorrow evening would be good for this. Jake met Beth's eyes, seeing hope and uncertainty there. The invitation felt significant, not just neighborly courtesy, but something more personal. Over the months, their friendship had deepened into something neither had quite acknowledged aloud. They were two people who understood loss, who had learned to rebuild their lives around their children's needs, who had found comfort in shared understanding. I'd like that, he said simply. Emma and I both would. Beth's smile transformed her face. Good. Tommy will be so excited. That evening, after Beth and Tommy had gone home and Emma was settled for the night, Jake found himself standing at Sarah's grave behind the cabin. The simple wooden cross marked the spot where the whole community had gathered 6 months ago to say goodbye. Wildflowers that Maria had planted were beginning to bloom around the edges. I think I'm ready to move forward, he said quietly to the marked earth. Not away from you, but towards something new. I hope you'd understand. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, and Jake chose to take it as blessing rather than reproach. When he returned to the cabin, Maria was sitting in a rocking chair with her mending, humming softly. You spoke with her, she said without looking up. Yes. And Jake settled into his own chair, considering the question. I think she wants Emma to have a complete family. She wants me to be happy again. Maria nodded approvingly. The dead do not need us to stop living. They need us to live well, to honor them by finding joy again. She looked up from her sewing. Beth is a good woman. Tommy is a good boy. They would be lucky to have you, just as you would be lucky to have them. And what about you? If Beth and I, if we become a family, then I become the grandmother I always hoped to be, Maria said warmly. This old woman has found her purpose in helping families grow strong. That does not change. Jake felt the last pieces of his resistance crumble. For months, he'd been afraid that moving toward new love would somehow diminish what he'd shared with Sarah. But sitting here, with Emma sleeping peacefully and Maria blessing his tentative steps toward happiness, he understood that love didn't decrease when shared. It multiplied. Tomorrow, he would take his daughter to dinner at Beth Coleman's house. And maybe, if he found the courage, he would begin building the future that all of them deserved. 1 year to the day after Sarah's death, Jake Morrison stood in his cabin wearing his best shirt, watching Maria pin wildflowers to Emma's tiny dress. Outside, neighbors were gathering. The same people who had arrived with supplies and hope during his darkest hour now come to celebrate new beginnings. She looks like an angel, Beth said softly, adjusting Emma's flower crown. At 15 months old, Emma was toddling everywhere, her dark curls bouncing as she explored the world with fearless curiosity. She babbled constantly now, and Jake swore she was already trying to say mama when she looked at Beth. Tommy stood proudly beside Jake, wearing a miniature version of Jake's vest. Am I really going to be Emma's big brother? He asked for the dozenth time that morning. The very best big brother, Jake assured him, his throat tight with emotion. The boy had taken to the role naturally, already protective and patient with Emma in ways that amazed the adults. Reverend Williams cleared his throat. Are we ready? Jake looked around the cabin, the same room where he'd nearly lost everything, now filled with love and laughter. Maria stood nearby, her weathered hands folded, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. She wore her finest shawl, the one she'd been saving, she claimed, for just such an occasion. "Wait," Jake said suddenly. He walked to the window that looked out towards Sarah's grave, marked now by a stone Tom Fletcher had carved and surrounded by Maria's carefully tended flowers. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I'll never forget you. Emma will know about her first mama, about how much you wanted her, how much you loved her. But I'm going to give her a complete family now, the way you would have wanted." He turned back to Beth, whose green eyes shimmered with understanding. "I promise to honor your memory by making sure our daughter knows she was twice blessed, loved by the mother who gave her life, and loved by the mother who will help her live it." The ceremony was simple but profound. In the same cabin where death had nearly claimed everything precious, Jake and Beth exchanged vows of love and commitment. Maria served as their spiritual guide, weaving together English and Spanish blessings that spoke of families chosen by the heart rather than blood. When it was over, the entire community celebrated with a feast that spilled from the cabin onto the porch and into the yard. Emma toddled between the guests, collecting hugs and treats, while Tommy regaled anyone who would listen with detailed plans for teaching his new sister to fish and ride horses. As evening fell and the neighbors began to drift home, Jake found himself on the porch holding his and Beth's 3-week-old son, little Samuel, named for Jake's father. The baby had arrived early, as if eager to join this growing family, and Maria had delivered him with the same steady competence she brought to everything. "Two babies in one house," Maria observed, settling into her rocking chair with Emma on her lap. "This old woman will have her hands full." "We all will," Beth laughed, leaning against Jake's shoulder. "But good full, happy full." Emma pointed toward the baby and made her newest sound, something that resembled BB in Maria's Spanish. Everyone laughed, and Emma clapped her hands in delight at being the center of attention. Jake looked around at his family, Beth's auburn hair catching the lamplight, Tommy building elaborate structures with wooden blocks, Maria teaching Emma a gentle Spanish lullaby, baby Samuel sleeping peacefully in his arms. The same cabin, the same mountains beyond, but everything transformed by love and community. A soft cry from Samuel brought Jake back to the moment. But this time, the sound of a baby crying in the night held no terror. This time, Jake rose with confidence, knowing exactly what to do, surrounded by people who would help if he faltered. As he walked his son to the window, patting his back gently, Jake could see lights twinkling in distant cabins, other families, other hearths, other stories of love and loss and hope. The isolation that had once defined his existence was gone, replaced by the warm certainty of belonging. Sometimes, he whispered to Samuel, echoing Maria's words from long ago, "The darkest nights bring the brightest dawns." Outside, the Colorado wilderness stretched vast and beautiful under a canopy of stars, no longer empty, but full of infinite possibility. And in the cabin that had once held only grief, a family slept peacefully, bound not by blood alone, but by the stronger ties of chosen love, shared struggle, and unshakable hope.